Hi, I'm Carol Perrineau, and we're going to be covering bead embroidery. Bead embroidery has been used over thousands of years over most civilizations to decorate man's personal effects, his clothing, his home. Even in Stone Age times, when man's main concern was basic survival, he and she had time to take an awl, pierce a shell, and string it onto their clothing or body using animal tendons or plant fiber. Contemporary fiber artists from all fields of work, whether you be a quilter, a doll maker, a costumer, even a bead worker, you'll find useful information in this bead embroidery video to incorporate in your work. Also, it will be useful to recognize the stitches so that if you buy a vintage piece that is damaged, you'll know how to repair it. Let's look at some seed beads that are appropriate for use in bead embroidery. These are transparent and opaque beads. Their color is an integral part of the glass. It will not fade or wash out. Iridescent finishes and luster finishes. These finishes are fumed on when the glass is hot, so they become an integral part of the bead. They also will not wash off. Ceylon or pearlized, painted and dyed, galvanized, metallic. These surface finishes are not permanent. They can wash off or be rubbed off over time. Color-lined beads, which have their color on the inside of the hole, are very pretty. They're a very popular Japanese bead nowadays. The color will not rub off the surface. However, after several washings, the colors can leach out or leach onto your sewing thread. If the garment that you're beading is eventually going to have to be washed or dry cleaned, then the beads will have to undergo the same process and survive. Take a pinch of beads and soak them overnight in acetone, which is nail polish remover, or put some of the different color beads you're going to use for a project in a 50-50 bleach water solution and see if the color changes. Or you can sew some of each color of the beads that you're going to use for a project onto a piece of fabric. Hand launder this fabric, or if it has to be dry cleaned, send it to the dry cleaners and ask them to run it through a couple times. Then notice the change in color. These galvanized beads here faded compared to the original color. The painted beads came off compared to the original color. The luster beads survived fine, the opaque beads survived fine, the iridescent beads survived fine, and here are some color-lined beads. The purple ones didn't make it, but the lime green ones did fine, so you just never know. It's really wise to take these precautions and test your beads for color fastness before you begin your project. That way you won't be disappointed and can make color changes ahead of time if necessary. UV light and sunlight can also be damaging and make our non-color fast beads fade. So if you're making a wall hanging, make sure it does not hang in sunlight. Sunlight's bad for your fabric anyway. If you make your beadwork as an applique, you can remove it from that dress when the dress becomes, well, out of fashion, and use your beadwork on a purse or a hat, and your beadwork becomes more timeless. Most seed beads have smooth edges around their holes. However, bugle beads are just pieces of cut cane or glass, and they have sharp edges. If the thread is coming out at a right angle to the edge of the bugle bead, it can get cut. So what I usually do is buffer the edges of the bugle bead with seed beads with their smooth holes. That way your thread won't get cut. If you can't find the color bead you want to use, a great trick is to use clear beads with colored embroidery floss. That way the color shows through the clear beads. Items you might find useful while doing bead embroidery. A bead tray container to hold your beads while working. I like the porcelain watercolor trays because they have many compartments and are heavy enough not to tip over as easily. Needle nose pliers to break an extra bead or help pull the thread through the fabric or leather. Be careful not to be too forceful though. You can break the eye off the needle or break the bead in half. I sometimes use a rubber grip or a balloon or rubber fingertips or that tacky bank teller salve to help me get a grip on the needle and help pull it through the fabric when it needs some coaxing. I usually use nylon thread like Nymo or Silamide or Conso. These are good and strong for bead embroidery. Small glass beads are heavy for their size, and that's a lot of weight for that thread to hold over time. Often I want to match the background fabric exactly so my thread doesn't show. Then I will use a good polyester sewing thread. When repairing vintage pieces, I would rather my thread break than the fabric rip. If the beadwork catches on something, it's easier to repair a fringe than to reweave a section of frayed silk. For stitches like Crazy Quilt, where the thread is just as much a design element as the beads, then fancy sparkly or shimmery threads can be used, like Ballet blending filaments. Nylon thread is slippery, so it's important to seal your knots with clear nail polish or fray check. Good sharp embroidery scissors are essential to make a clean cut on your thread. This can be worn as a pendant, and it's also a very safe thread cutter. Sometimes I use a leather thimble to protect my fingertips to keep them from turning into a pin cushion. These oval adhesives are wonderful also to protect the tip of your finger. If you're a bead worker, you may want to use a needle a little heavier than that size 12 beading needle you're used to using. The size 12 beading needle will bend more easily when you're taking a bite of fabric with it. My favorite needle for bead embroidery is the milliner's needle. It's also called the straw needle. It's a little shorter than a beading needle but longer than your normal sewing needle. Quilters may be used to using betweens or sharps. You can also use now a short beading needle. It comes in tapestry point and pointed. It has a long oval eye and it's much easier to thread. For canvas work, there's now a twin pointed needle. You don't have to turn the needle when you're doing your canvas work. The eye is right in the middle of the needle. For leather work, you'll be using a Glover's needle. Glover's needle is lance-shaped. It cuts the leather as it goes through, and it comes in several sizes. For doing three-dimensional work on bead embroidery, it's hard to get back to the base where the fabric is, so a nice curved needle is nice for getting in there. It's always important not to practice acupuncture without a license. You don't want to stab your husband as he's walking through the living room. This little magnetic wand will find that needle that you've dropped in the carpeting. Embroidery hoops that have a tension screw are great because you can move the hoop around over your beadwork and you can loosen it as the beadwork falls over the edge of the hoop and not crack the beads. You don't want to pull your fabric too tightly in the hoop. We are not making a musical instrument here. If you pull it too tightly, once you release it from the hoop, the embroidery stitches will pull and crumple the piece and it will become a sculptural piece instead of a flat piece now. If your fabric is too small for the embroidery hoop you have, take another piece of fabric and cut a window in it and baste your smaller piece of fabric inside that. There are many fabrics to choose from for use with bead embroidery. A simple woven non-stretch broadcloth is great. You just have to remember to pre-shrink the fabric before use if the garment is going to be laundered. Traditionally, Native Americans used leather. This is great. We can use this nowadays, but we also have the option of using facile or ultra suede. It's a little easier to pull your needle through and it comes in great colors. We can use a heavy felt, a heavy interfacing like Pellon, and this is Aida cloth, which is used in canvas work. We all remember the traditional bridal gowns with their beaded lace. You just have to remember not to carry your thread across the sheer areas of the lace. Some of the more difficult fabrics to stitch on are stretch fabrics like lycra or knits. You don't want to carry your thread from beaded area to beaded area. You want to knot each separate bead area independently so the fabric will still stretch. Likewise, with knitted garments like a sweater, there are loose stitches so the sweater will stretch. And always line your beadwork to save the sewing threads from abrasion so that they will last longer. We're going to learn several different kinds of stitches. We're also going to be learning scatter beading, running stitch, back stitch and couching, canvas work, edgings, fringes, and several other stitches that will be incorporated into projects that I have designed for you. In your video insert, you'll find a list of the materials needed for each of these projects and the pattern used. For the first project, we're going to work violets on Aida cloth. Here's the project almost completed except for a small area of background. On this piece, I only beaded the flowers, and the background was done in just floss. Size 11 beads work for size 14 Aida cloth canvas or size 28 count linen. Here's the pattern from your insert. You'll be reading this pattern from left to right, right to left, left to right, and then right to left all the way across, and continue reading back and forth, snaking back and forth on the pattern. So let's start beading this. Got out my 14 count Aida cloth. I do not put a knot in the end of my thread. We're going to bring our needle through one of the little holes in the canvas to the front, and on the back side here we're going to leave a couple inch tail like that. There are no knots on the back here. We will tie this off later with a back stitch. Hold that with your fingers. When we look at our pattern, the first row is a light colored olive bead. Pick that up. When we're working from left to right in our first row, our needle will go in the upper right hand corner of the box where the bead is going to sit. In the next row, we're going to work right to left. Bead needs to sit one box to the right of the bead we just added. And that's going to be a light colored olive bead. Pick up your bead, and when you're working right to left, your stitch also goes right, upper right to lower left in the little box going through the little holes formed in the canvas. Next bead on your pattern is a dark olive bead. And you're going to work diagonally upper right to lower left. Next row we're going to work left to right, and the bead is going to sit directly underneath of the one we just ended on, and it again is a dark colored bead. Now you're noticing I see purple thread. I'm using purple thread so you can see my thread pass, but normally you would be using thread that matched your canvas, cream colored thread. This row is worked left to right, so our thread comes out of the lower left and goes to the upper right corner. Next bead is a light colored olive. Pick up our olive bead. We're working lower left to upper right in the box. And another light olive colored bead. Come up through the canvas, lower left, pick up a bead, and stitch into upper right. On row 4 here, we're going to be working right to left, but we have to swing way out here to pick up these beads. We're going to count 1, 2, 3 empty boxes, 1, 2, 3 boxes that are going to be having beads on them. Remember, when we're working right to left, we come up in the upper right hand corner, go down in the lower left hand corner. Come up in the upper right, down in the lower left. So let's count over that number of boxes now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm in the upper right hand corner of box number 6, and I'm going to pick up a lavender bead and stitch down into the lower left. Come up in upper right, another lavender bead, down in lower left. Now you're noticing I'm not using an embroidery hoop. This canvas is pretty thick or stiff, and I really don't have to, as long as you don't stitch too tightly. Down and lower left. Now we have 3 spaces to skip over. 1, 2, 3. And so our next beads are going to be right underneath and identical in color to the previous row of green beads. Our first one is a light olive, upper right to lower left. Now in our pattern we're going to skip 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spaces. There's the 8th box, which is the first of our next color bead, which is a medium purple. And we're going to do 3 medium purple beads. Upper right, lower left. And that's all there is to it. Just follow your graph back and forth, left to right to left, following the color changes in the pattern. Even when I'm dead tired at the end of the night, this is a great stitch to do. I rarely make mistakes. It is so methodical and soothing to do. I love this stitch. What I need to show you now is how to end your threads and start new ones. So just to end your thread, you have all these little parallel vertical stitches on the back of your canvas. We're not going to tie knots. We're just going to take our thread and go underneath those stitches like that. Pull it through. And then I do a back stitch. I go through them again. You don't want knots in case you make this a picture, or if it's against something flat, those knots will push through to the front and make a little bump. Now we can cut our thread off. Leave a little tail. You'll do the same thing with your starting thread. Put a needle on it and stitch underneath through some vertical bars of thread, and then back stitch and underneath again. Here's our beaded project, almost done except for a small piece in my background. I used floss in a continental needlework stitch for the background. This is rayon floss or silk floss. Or you can bead the background with solid beadwork. When you want to finish off your piece, clip it close to the edge, about 1/2 inch all around. You can take another piece of fabric, put them right side to right side, stitch very close to the edge of your beadwork around 3 sides. You'll turn it right side out. You can stuff it and make it into a pin cushion, or you can just fold back all your edges and put it in a nice little picture frame. I have several examples of how you can use your beaded canvas work. Here's a beaded footstool. This was done in Victorian times. Here also is a beaded fireplace screen. First stitches we're going to practice on are called running stitch and scatter beading. Get some supplies out to practice on, some plain broadcloth, your embroidery hoop, your little dish, some beads. You can work with size 11s or larger beads if you want. I'm using a milliner's needle and some regular sewing thread. My thread is going to contrast to my fabric so you can see it, but if you want to match it, that's just fine. So here is my fabric. I'm going to take one of my washout pencils and I'm going to draw a little line on it. I'm going to use this to follow for practice. I'm actually going to make a knot in the end of my sewing thread this time. I take the end of my thread, wrap it around my needle 5, 6 times, slide it all down together, grasp that with my thumbnail and slide it over the eye, hold it all and slide it to the end of my thread. And I have a little knot now. We're going to come up at the base of our little line that we've drawn. And let's pick up, 2 beads this time. Slide the beads down. I hold that thread right along the line, snug the beads down on the thread so they're nice and snug on there. Take our needle, go vertically perpendicular to the fabric, pushing the beads and straight in front of the beads. Push it in your fabric. Let's try that again. This is running stitch. We're going to take spaces between the beads, put different amounts of beads on each time. Let's pick up 3 beads this time. Slide the beads down, lay the thread right over the line that you've drawn, push the beads against the thread where it's emerging from the fabric so they're nice and snug. Take our needle perpendicular to the fabric, pushing on the beads straight into the fabric on the line. Pull the needle through. One more time. Come up on the line. Oh, my needle came unthreaded. I should show you how to thread it anyway. This is my way of doing it. Pull the thread down between your fingers so just the tip of it is sticking out there. Take the eye of your needle so it's facing you. Lay the eye right on top of where that thread is sitting between your fingers and slowly open your fingers. Oh, magic! The thread goes right through the eye of the needle. Look at that. I cannot see that eye right now. I don't have my bifocals on. Okay, this time let's just try picking up 1 bead. Slide the bead down. Thread is right on the line that we've drawn. Snug the bead up. Needle is perpendicular to the fabric and pushing on the bead a little bit and straight into the fabric. Now, what if we do this wrong? If we have some beads on there, let's put a couple beads on there. Slide them down, and let's say they're not snugged up. We angle the needle outward away from the beads. We're going to have a stitch where the beads slide back and forth and move apart. See, like that. They're not nice and tight on there. They're going to move around and they will probably break the thread. Let's try another bad stitch. Let's put a couple beads on there. Slide them down. What if we push it up and we angle the needle inward toward the beads instead of perpendicular to the fabric? Pull that up, and our beads kind of hump up a little bit. This is what we would do if we were sewing on our knit fabric, so that our bead stitch is bigger than the fabric, so the fabric can move. But we're working on woven cloth right now, and we don't want to do that. We want the bead stitch to equal exactly the length of the beads. Now let's try scatter beading. We're not going to draw a line because scatter beading is used just as a fill-in. When you're filling in an area of beadwork solidly. It's done 1 bead at a time. There's our 1 bead, but it's the same concept. You're snugging up that bead on the thread, go straight into the fabric in front of the bead. We're just going to come up right next to him. And you notice I'm not working in a line. I'm going to angle out this way now. Snug that bead up on the thread, straight into the fabric in front of it. Beads are angling in different directions, and they're all touching edges right next to each other. It makes a really nice texture when you're filling in a solid area. This one's going to point down. Snug the bead up, straight into the fabric, and you just work outward. Now let me show you a few older pieces that are made using the stitch I just showed you. Here are some buttons that used scatter beading. However, the scatter beading, they are separated. Fabric is showing in between them. Here's an old hat pin. Scatter beading again, the beading is a lot closer together. And this great one is an old pin cushion. And the background white beads that are, well, dirty white, they're scatter beading also. Just a little bit of fabric is showing through. This little bag that's done with steel beads is a nice example of uniform running stitch. Okay, let me show you another stitch. This one's called lazy stitch, and well, it's anything but lazy. You need to pick up uniform beads and watch carefully while working, but it's a good stitch for covering a large area quickly. It was very commonly used by Native Americans here. We're going to start by picking up 4 beads. Slide the 4 beads down to your fabric. Snug up the beads and stitch directly in front of those 4 beads. This is just like the running stitch that you just did. Now I'm going to take a pencil and I'm going to mark the ends of my rows so I have nice straight lines here. I'm going to come up through the fabric on the left side where I just came down, and I'm going to try and come up 1 bead stitch away from where I just went into the fabric. We're going to pick up 4 more beads now. Try and pick up uniform beads. Slide the beads over, snug them up, and go directly in front of the 4 beads into the fabric. Now let's critique our second row here. It's not quite touching the first row on every bead, and my bead stitch was a little too short, so my beads are humped up a little bit. Let's try it again. Come up on the right side this time. 1 bead stitch, you're estimating that bead width away from the previous row. Pick up 4 beads. Slide the beads down to your fabric. Push the beads up so they're nice and snug and directly into the fabric. Ah, that's a little better. One more time. Come up 1 bead the width away. Pick up 4 beads. Slide the beads down. Snug the beads up and into the fabric. Now this stitch can be worked like this, where all the rows are touching each other to cover a solid area of beadwork, or the stitch can be worked so there's space in between the beads, angling in different directions. But basically the stitch is similar to running stitch in that you are picking up several beads at a time, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 beads at a time, and they're all stitched at one time with 1 thread holding it down. Here's an African piece of beaded work using the lazy stitch. Notice if you use uniform beads, you can get a geometric pattern there. This bracelet was probably made for the tourist trade. Here's a little ribbon done with lazy stitch again. They're angled, and nice use of color blending. Here's a little Native American bag, again lazy stitch, but they're not touching as much around the edges There's fabric showing in between, and in the middle, they're done at a diagonal. On the bird here, we have lazy stitch done around these concentric circles, and lazy stitch over the edging of the wings. Now I'm going to show you back stitch. This is one of my favorite stitches, and it's very versatile. You can use it to outline, you can use it to fill in a solid area. Get your little practice fabric here, and let's draw, like a little snail shell that slowly circles in like that. We're going to start on the outside edge. And to begin, let's pick up, 4 beads. Slide the beads down to your fabric. Make the beads line up right on your line. Snug them up. This is reminiscent of the last 2 stitches. Straight into the fabric in front of the beads. Now, we need to come up between the second and third bead. What I do is I'm pushing against the fabric with the tip of my needle so it makes a little indent, but I'm not pushing so hard that it pushes through the fabric. This way I can see where my needle is. Now I'm right between the second and third bead, right on that blue line. Come up, and I'm going to go back, hence back stitch, through the third and fourth bead that I just picked up. Okay, let's do it again. Pick up 4 beads, slide them down to the fabric, and with my left thumb I'm holding the edge of the thread against the hoop. Snug those beads up and go straight into the fabric on the blue line. Drag my needle across the back of the fabric, come up between the second and third bead right on the blue line, and back through the third and fourth bead. And we're approaching a curve. Let's just pick up 3 beads this time. As you come to curvy areas, you won't be able to pick up as many beads per stitch. I rotated my hoop a little bit so that my left hand can hold that thread right on top of the blue line. Drag my needle across the back, and I'm going to come up between the second and third bead. Let's try 3 more beads again. Up between the first and second bead this time. On curves, sometimes you might want to come up on the outside of the curvature of your line just a little bit. It'll accentuate the curve in beads that way. Now continue working inward, spiraling inward on your little snail shell pattern. The tighter the curve, the fewer beads you'll be able to pick up at the same time and stay on directly on top of your design line. Near the end, you're probably only going to be able to pick up 1 bead at a time and back stitch through it. So now continue working on your spiral. Now here I've completed my little snail shell using back stitch. Some of these beads are a little wobbly on the line. That's because the thread is so thin compared to the size of the hole. I'm using larger beads so that you can see the beads while I'm working. Normally this wouldn't be a problem, but in bead embroidery you do want your thread size to take up a significant part of the whole of the bead. Now I want you to take your pencil and draw a straight line on your fabric and do back stitch along this line. I picked up 3 beads at a time and back stitched and went back through 2 of them the whole way. Again, this line is a little wobbly. There's beads out of sorts here. I'm going to show you a little trick that we'll use in one of the projects later. I'm going to come up on the end of the beads that I've already back stitched through, and I'm going to just take one long stitch, oops, through all of those beads, and that extra thread going through those beads will help straighten them up. There we go. Now they're a little straighter because there's more thread in the hole of the bead. So let's look at the diagram of backstitch. We picked up 4 beads under the fabric, back up in between the 2nd and 3rd bead and back through the 3rd and 4th bead. And again down here we picked up 4 beads, down through the fabric, up through the 2nd and 3rd bead that we picked up, and back through the 3rd and 4th bead. It's a great stitch. Now let's try some couching. Couching involves 2 needles and 2 threads. I'm going to use separate colors here. The idea in couching is that you're using 2 needles because one needle is always staying on top of your fabric. It's your needle for your beads. So we're usually using a beading needle on top. The other needle is going up and down through the fabric. This is usually done on leather, so it's a glover's needle. That's the needle that is lance-shaped and actually cuts the leather as it goes through it. I'm going to be using 2 milliner's needle right now because I'm working just on broadcloth. So we have our beading needle on top, and I'm going to pick up a few beads. Or you can pick up many beads and slide them into place at the same time, whatever you want to do. 4 beads, slide them down to the fabric, snug them up, and with my other needle, which would normally be my glover's needle, I'm going to come up directly in front of those beads. I go around the thread, snug up the beads, and back down through the fabric in front of the beads on the other side of the thread. So I stick my couching needle in the fabric while I'm not using them. My beading needle again. I'm going to pick up more beads. Slide the beads up. Put that needle in our fabric. Couching needle comes up directly in front of the beads, over the thread, and back down. Now you want that couching thread to be directly in front of the beads, because if it's not and you leave a space, the next set of beads won't be able to slide up to the previous set of beads and you'll have a little space. Also, if you pull the couching thread too tight, it will pull the beading thread down into the fabric and make a dimple. And again, the next beads won't be able to slide up to the previous beads and there'll be a little space. This is supposed to be a continuous line of beads. Now I'm doing just a straight line right now, but if you were to do curves again, just like your back stitch, you would have to pick up fewer and fewer beads at a time as you go around a tight curve to keep all the beads in line. Here's our beading thread always staying on top of the fabric, and it's the one that the beads are sliding onto. Here's our couching thread coming up through the fabric, around the beading thread, and back into the fabric. Again over here, we've picked up 3 more beads. The couching thread comes up directly in front of those beads, around the thread, and back into the fabric. So the couching thread is sewing up and down, beading thread always on top. Now of course we have a little trick here. I'm going to pick up several beads, let's say 6. Slide them down. Now my ultimate goal here is to make a little zigzag. I'm going to go into the fabric. Obviously that stitch is much longer See how I did that? I came up, I'm going to couch over the thread here to hold it in place. Now I'm going to go behind the last bead, between the 5th and 6th bead. I'm going to come up, go back through the 6th bead. So here was my couch, here was my back stitch. Let's add another 6 beads. Again, into the fabric. The stitch length is going to be much longer than the bite of fabric. I'm going to come up, grab that loop. I'm going to couch over it. Come back up between the 5th and 6th bead and back stitch through the last bead. Now, this is cheating. I'm letting you know that. This is not something I would enter in the state fair, but for you costumers that have to do something that looks dramatic on stage, from a distance you can't tell that some of those beads are popping up. So this is a good quickie thing just to get the job done. Here we have a collection of beadwork pieces that are contemporary and historic. This one is a piece of old Athapascan beadwork using backstitch. You can see how backstitch can be used as an outline stitch or as a fill-in stitch where it's solid beadwork. Look at the great shapes you can achieve with backstitch. Here's a little strawberry keychain from the 50s, solid backstitch beadwork. These are contemporary beaded buttons done in couching in concentric circles using just a button form. You can do this yourself with any size button. Here's a very small beaded pin done on felt. This is done by Angela Gauthier in Washington. Every bead is couched in between. Here's another contemporary piece done by an artist, Joanne Lasig. The little goose is done in couching, and you'll notice that the background is scatter beading, which you've learned earlier. This is another contemporary piece that I did using antique tiny beads, size 16s through 22s. I used backstitch, couching, and well, you know, that little variation between the backstitch and couching, my cheating method. Now here's a very early beaded bag using steel beads that's entirely couched on leather. Over here we can see the bead threads staying on top and the couching threads going up and down through the leather. I like these old pieces that are falling apart because we can see the threads and they're great educational tools. Now you've been very patient and you've practiced your stitches on your little hoop. It's time to do a real project. Okay, I've made a couple really great pin projects for you using several of the stitches that we've already gone over. Get out your insert and let's look at the pattern and see which stitches were done where. Make a photocopy of your pattern. You can make it larger or smaller if you'd like, and then clip the paper within about 1/2 inch of the outer edges. Baste this to your fabric and your hoop that you're going to use. I've used ultra suede or facile, that's my favorite fabric. Here's the pin completely beaded. First we're going to do back stitch all around the outlines, your little black lines. Then we're going to fill in the solid areas. The turquoise area here is all back stitch. The seafoam green area here is picot stitch. I haven't shown you that, but we're going to do it. And then the pink area here are tiny short fringes. Again, we'll go over those for you. So now let me show you some of those stitches. I've got my milliner's needle here, And I've got some blue Nymo D thread on it with my knot already made. I'm going to come up through my fabric, and sometimes it's a little hard finding your place on that paper, but we want to come up directly on the line, the outline stitch. So now let's pick up 4 little gray beads. Refer to your insert for the different colors used in the different areas. There's your little gray beads. You're going to do back stitch all around the black lines, completely outlining the pattern in gray back stitch. You already know that, so let's move on to the next one. In this area here, again, it's back stitch, all with the turquoise beads. Darker turquoise is in this area, and then there's one line of back stitch all around the outside perimeter of this area. The back stitch goes back and forth with the rows just touching each other and kind of follows the contours of the shape. All in back stitch right there. Now the next stitch, the picot stitch. Let's do that one. I'm going to come up in the middle of the area where the picot stitch is, because we're going to pretend those little gray back stitch outlines are already there. The picot stitch is done with 2 different colors of green beads. I'm going to pick up the medium seafoam, a light seafoam, and a medium seafoam. Slide the 3 beads down, and they're going to actually be 3-dimensional and sit up. Take a small step. It's almost like 1 bead width, the stitch. So the beads sit up. They do not lie flat on the fabric. And then come up again through the last bead. You do not want to come up again in the exact same hole that you went down in, otherwise your beads will fall off the fabric and we won't have a picot stitch. So you're taking a tiny back stitch in the fabric and the beads sit there. Let's try one more. The first stitch we picked up 3 beads. From now on, that last bead is shared between the first stitch and the second stitch. So we only have to pick up 2 beads, a light colored seafoam and a medium colored seafoam. Slide the beads down to your work, and we're going to look at where our last stitch was and approximate 1 bead width away from our last stitch. There it is. Take a tiny little stitch backwards, but still come up through the same last bead. And you again will do rows of this picot stitch following the contours of this area. This is just great because it's a 3-dimensional stitch and your pin will have depth to it. Each row should just be touching the previous row. Now the center area, and I'm actually going to use a different colored thread because these are different colored beads in the center. Each of the areas my thread was matching the beads. I'm using a seashell pink colored beads now, so I'm using a pink thread. When you have transparent beads, your thread will actually enhance the color sometimes if it's a deeper color. So this is a rose colored thread. This stitch is a tiny little fringe. Most of the time we think of fringes on the edge, but if you make really short fringes, they can become a 3-dimensional surface embellishment. And if we do them all close together, it's like little bristly hairs standing up. So we're going to pick up a tiny bugle bead, a little pink bead, and a yellow bead. And that yellow bead that's a different color is referred to in fringes as the terminal bead. I'm going to lay them down so you can see them here. Here's the yellow bead. Slide him out of the way. Go back through the pink bead and the pink bugle and back into the same hole that you came out of. Pull that up, and it stands straight up. Isn't that great? Let's do another one right next to them. You're going to pack these little short fringes right in next to each other, but at the same time, again, following line contours of this area. Let's do one more. Pick up a short bugle, tiny pink bead, tiny little soft yellow bead. Slide them all down to your fabric. I actually slide the little yellow terminal bead out of the way, back through the two pink beads, and let's see if we can do it all in one. Yep, there we go. All in one fell swoop. I went back through the hole that we just came out of. Pull it up. I've tilted the piece so that now you can actually see the three-dimensionality of these stitches, how they will actually stand up a little bit here in the picot area and a lot more as we spiral into the center of the nautilus here. So fill in this area now with all these tiny little short fringes, following again the outline contours of this area. Do little circles in there, back and forth, so all the little fringes just touch each other side by side. You've finished beading your nautilus. Doesn't it look great? Now we need to tear away the excess paper from our pattern that's sticking out the edge here. If you have any troubles, crease your paper with your thumbnail and maybe even put a little bit of moisture, a little bit of water in there. It won't hurt your ultra suede. I've done mine on tissue paper, so it's going to pull away a little easier. But use your thumbnail and your fingernail to slowly tear away the paper as close to the edge as you can. All done. If you have any pieces sticking out here, carefully take your scissors in, or even better, tweezers, and pull that excess paper out. We don't want any paper showing. The pattern inside is stitched there for eternity between your beads and your fabric. Now we're going to make a little stabilizer for the pin that will be inserted inside to make it stiff. My favorite material for this is milk jug plastic, plastic that milk jugs are made out of. Take a little section of milk jug that you've washed and lay it directly over your beadwork. I use a permanent marker or a pen and carefully draw the outline of the beadwork, but about a good 1/8 inch within the outer edge of the beadwork. This is fitting inside. Draw the entire perimeter of the piece, and then you're going to cut it out. There's my cutout piece. And see how the cutout fits within the size of the beadwork. It's actually smaller than the outside edges. Now we're going to cut out the beadwork out of the fabric. When you cut along the edge of the beadwork, do remember there are tiny little threads there you don't want to cut. However, you want to get as close as possible, about a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, a millimeter away. Very close. Use nice sharp embroidery scissors so you're not fighting with them. There. We've liberated the piece. Now we're going to take our extra ultra suede here. We're going to lay our beadwork right over top of the extra ultra suede, and we're going to cut out the backing. Take your pencil, and we're just going to trace around the outside edge of your beadwork. And now we're going to cut that piece out. That will be our backing for the pin. It's so important to make the back of your pin look just as clean and neat as the front that's beaded. You've cut your backing fabric out. If it isn't exactly the same size as your beadwork, put the two together and then just trim up the edges so they're exactly the same size. Now we're going to attach the pin to it. Take your little pin back, lay it right on top of your plastic. I plan on wearing my pin vertically with the point down so the bail opening is pointed down. I'm going to take a little permanent marker. I'm going to mark on either side of the hinge and the bail opening. And we're going to take a little punch if you have one, or just take your scissors, but be careful. And we're going to punch out that area. There we go. Take the plastic and lay it over top of your backing fabric. And you're going to mark through the little hole in the plastic onto the fabric, just a little dot. And now we're going to cut out the area around that little dot. You can again use the punch again, a small punch if you have one, or just take your scissors and bend the fabric and make a little clip. It doesn't have to be exactly a round hole because your fabric will stretch to accommodate the finding. Lay the two together so the holes match up. Open your finding, and we're going to put the finding through these pieces so just the pin back shows. And that big ugly stainless steel part is hidden inside. There we go. And again, the fabric will stretch around that. Oh, there we go. Close the pin, close the bail around it, the safety latch, so that it will be out of the way and doesn't poke us when we are stitching our edging. Now we're going to put the backing on our beadwork. Now let's use the picot stitch to stitch the backing to the beadwork with the plastic and the pin back attached inside. I'm going to use a milliner's needle and my Nymo D thread in a gray color that matches the fabric. Has a knot already in it, so I'm just going to pierce the top piece of fabric, the beadwork, so that the knot rests inside between the beadwork and the backing. Now, picot stitch, this sounds familiar. We did this on the surface, but now we're going to do it on the edge. I'm going to use size 14 beads. I'm going to pick up a little gray bead, a little pink bead, and a little gray bead. 3 beads to start. Line everything up, and I'm going to stitch through the backing and the beadwork fabric just on the edge. Push the needle through from the back of the fabric to the front. You can take a very tiny bite of fabric on the edge here with facile and ultra suede because they won't rip. Go back through the last bead with the needle coming towards your body now. Now, from now on, you will pick up 2 beads at a time. I'm picking up a little pink bead and a little gray bead. We're going to take another bite of fabric very close to the edge, 1 bead width away. Needle point is coming towards me. Now we go back through the last bead, again with the needle coming towards me. So this stitch is actually decorative, and it's stitching the back to the front, and it's structural. I'm going to flip the pin over so that you can see the little stitches better. Also note that the thread is taking a tiny bite of fabric back here, and that's why I picked gray thread, so it matches my fabric and blends in better and is not as obvious. Let's do a few more stitches. Pink bead, gray bead, bite of fabric from, now we're going front to back. One bead width away from the previous stitch. This time the needle's coming towards me. Second half of the stitch, go back through the last bead. Needle's going away from me. Pull it tight. Pink bead, gray bead, through the edge of the fabric, catching the front and back about one bead width away from the previous stitch. Needle's coming toward me. Now the needle's going away from me, going back through the last bead. When you get all the way around, you're going to want to connect your last picot stitch to your very first picot stitch to make it look continuous. At that point, you will pick up one pink bead and go into the very first gray bead of your picot stitch. And then you will tie a knot with your thread just like a regular sewing knot. Take a bite of fabric and go back through the loop of thread and make a little knot. Then seal your knot with a little bit of fray check, just a tiny bit or a tiny bit of clear nail polish. You don't want to stain the fabric, you just want to seal the knot. Let's go over making the house pin now. You know all the stitches, so let's just review where they go. Here's your paper pattern, and it's basted to my facile in an embroidery hoop. Outline all the areas first of the house with backstitch. Then I fill in with lines of backstitch. Chimney outlined, fill in. In the grass and the planting area, that's all scatter beading. One bead at a time, turn different directions, and I blended colors down here. Look in your insert for the colors. The little shrubbery is done with little short fringes, so they become three-dimensional. The little cat and the little bird are held in place with head pins that are sewn inside. When I finished this pin and did the backing, I did not want a fussy picot stitch. I just wanted a clean edge. So what I did is I just whip stitched the backing to the beadwork with thread. Here are my little stitch lines done in gray so it matches the fabric. If you're selling pieces or giving them away, take a permanent marker and sign your work. This is a little work of art. And there's your pin ready to wear. I'd like to show you some embroidery stitches embellished with beads. You'll find a lot of uses for these. Let's start by getting out your hoop and some broadcloth. I'm using a short beading needle because of that long oval eye, so I can thread the floss in it easier. I've got some colored floss. I'm using 3 strands, and I've marked my fabric with some straight parallel lines to follow. I just used a pencil. This is a sampler. We're going to start with the stem stitch. Basic stem stitch. Take a little bite of fabric. Hold my thread down out of the way, about 1/8 of an inch there. and pull it through. I always keep my thread down. The bite of fabric and the distance from the previous stitch are about equal. Now let's start to add some beads to the stitch. Pick up a bead and do your basic stem stitch with a bead on your floss. You can put the beads on every stitch. You can put a bead on 3 stitches in a row, then do no beads for 3 stitches in a row. Now this is just basic. Let's try angling our stem stitch a little bit. Angle across your line. Angle again. So our stitch is almost vertical into the fabric. It's about a 1/2 inch long, and they're separated. Thread up and out of the way. Come over about a 1/2 inch, and you're going to vertically take a bite of fabric. And they're separated now. 1/2 inch away. Now let's just take a few stitches like that without any beads, and we're going to come back and decorate them. Now I'm going to pick up a few beads, go back right into the holes underneath your stitch, and these beads are going to sit vertically between those little stem stitches. Go into the top of the stitch, come out the bottom of the stem stitch from before that you made, and the bead sits vertically. You can do this with smaller beads and be picking up more beads at a time. Just let your imagination go. I'm going to take a little bite of fabric just so I can move my thread over. And let's try substituting a bugle bead for that stem stitch. Remember, the bugle beads are the long cut canes. So I'm going to pick up a bugle bead here, and I need to slide him down to the fabric so I make sure that the stitch length equals the bugle bead length. There's our bugle bead. We want him to angle just like those previous stem stitches. Go into the fabric right there. We're going to come up directly below. Add another bugle bead. One more. Come up underneath the line, straight underneath the last stitch. One more bugle bead, and then we will add seed beads in between them. Now you're going to say, wait a minute, Carol warned me earlier about stitching those bugle beads down, that they have sharp edges and to buffer them with seed beads. Yes, they do, but we're using several strands of floss here, and there's not going to be a lot of abrasion on them, so they're probably going to be pretty safe. So I came up at the back side, the bottom side of that last stitch of the bugle bead, and I'm picking up a couple little seed beads here. We're going to do the same thing that we just did. Let's go down this way at the top of the bugle bead, come up at the base of the bugle bead, pick up 3 more seed beads, slide them down to your cloth, and then insert your needle into the top of the next bugle bead. There. I'm sure you can think of lots of variations on that stitch, but let's try another one. Let's do the buttonhole stitch now. I'm going to come up on my next line here. The buttonhole stitch is basically a little L shape. I'm going to insert my needle below the line and come up on the line. The thread is above my needle and then below the needle. There we have a little upside down L. Let's do it again. Insert the needle below the line, come up on the line, thread above and under the needle. One more. On the line, thread under the needle, pull through. Buttonhole stitch. When it's separated like this, it's also known as a blanket stitch. Now let's add some beads to it. I'm going to pick up 3 beads. And we want that vertical stitch to equal the 3 bead length, so they aren't wobbly on there. So see your 3 bead length. Estimate that length into the fabric, up to the line. The thread is underneath the needle, the beads are off to the side. Pull through, and there are the beads sitting vertically. One more time. Pick up 3 beads. Slide the beads down into the fabric, up to the line, nice and vertical. You can follow the grain of your fabric to keep you vertical and horizontal. Thread is underneath the needle and pull through. What if we were to make our blanket stitch go on either side of the line? Let's come above the line and back to the line. Come below the line and back to the line. Now instead of an edging stitch, this is more decorative stitch on the surface. There we go. Above the line, back to the line. Below the line, back to the line with the thread underneath our needle as we pull through. Now with this one, when I decorated it with beads, I do the embroidery stitch first, and then I come back with my needle and thread and add beads around the stitch. You can put beads on top of the little dots, like dotting an eye. You can put beads in between there. I'll show you a sample of that one later, but let's learn all the stitches first. Let's try the good old lazy daisy stitch. We're going to take a loop of thread, pull it off to the side. Insert your needle right where your thread emerged from the fabric. Take a bite of fabric the length that you want your petal, your lazy daisy, to be. And then it's like you're couching around the tip of that thread, back into the fabric, around the outside of the thread now, your loop of thread. There we go. There's one lazy daisy. And I'm going to do a cluster of 3 of them, all with their bases together. Come out of the fabric, loop of thread up and around, insert your needle back into the base. I'm going to go straight vertically this time, about the same height. Come out of the fabric, the thread is underneath the needle. Pull up, not too tight. There we go, and then stitch into the fabric right on the other side of the thread. Now let's do another lazy daisy over here. I'm going to pick up 3 beads, slide them down to the fabric. I'm going to make my little loop, insert my needle in, into the fabric on the other side of the loop, and now I have beads on a lazy daisy stitch all on one side. Now I bet you can think of lots of variations on this one too. What if you put beads all the way around the lazy daisy stitch or dotted it? Let's get a new thread here, and I'm going to show you my favorite stitch. This is the feather stitch. This time I'm going to work right to left, and we're just going to do the stitch first. Let's not worry about beads yet. Come out of the fabric and you'll notice I have 3 lines here. They're going to kind of help guide me. Stick into the fabric directly across from where you emerged from the fabric, and then come up about 3/8 of an inch away directly between the 2 lines. So your stitch is at an angle. Now what we're going to do, the thread is coming out of here. We're going to come over here, directly across, take a bite of fabric again, about 3/8 of an inch, and we're going to come up on that middle line. Position our thread over here now. Thread is coming out of the middle line. We're going to stick the needle into the line on the bottom, angle it up. Let's get our thread up a little more. Needle emerges halfway between the bottom line and the middle line. We're going to go directly across, insert the needle halfway between the middle line and the top line. The needle angles and you come up on the middle line about 3/8 of an inch away. And the needle always pulls out on top of that loop of thread. Isn't this a great stitch? It looks like it could be a vine. It looks very organic. Or it could become very geometric if you pulled the stitches very taut. Then they will angle even more. Now let's add some beads. I'm going to pick up about 3 seed beads again. Slide them down. They don't have to be all the way down. I'm going to have them sit on the outside edge here. Insert my needle. I'm going to emerge halfway between the bottom and the middle line. Thread goes underneath the needle. Pull it up. And the beads are going to sit on the outside edge of that V. Let's do it again. Pick up 3 beads. We're going to angle the thread in a loop this way. Insert the needle halfway between the middle line and the top line. Needle comes up on the middle line on top of the loop of thread. There we go. And I'll show you some variations of that later on my sampler. Next stitch. Come up directly below here. Again, I have 3 lines drawn parallel to each other, somewhat closer together. And let's do the herringbone stitch. You bead workers are going to say, wait a minute, herringbone is a bead stitch. Herringbone is also an embroidery stitch. I'm going to come out of the fabric on the bottom line, insert the needle at an angle on the top line. Like we're going to make an X. We're going to insert it again on the bottom line. Take a little bite of fabric on the bottom line. Now we're going to move up to the top line. We're going to take a little bite of fabric, moving from right to left with our needle. And again, we're going to make the X. The cross of the X should be off-centered. Come to the bottom here, a little bite of fabric. One more stitch, and then let's add some beads. Okay, I'm going to add some larger beads this time, maybe some 8s. Bite of fabric on the bottom, pull it up, and I'm not going to add any beads on this stitch. So we're only adding beads on the stitches that are going from upper left to lower right. Bite of fabric on the bottom. I only added 2 beads that time. Bite of fabric. So we've got 2 above, this time we've got 1 above. Okay, this time we're going to pick up 1 bead. Bite of fabric on the bottom. And then we just stitch on the top with no beads. So you too might want to play around with this a little bit until you get the look that you want. Take out what you don't want, or just keep this as a sampler. This is a great reference to come back to for future projects. Let's try another stitch. These are basically just, can't even think of how to describe them, just little stitches, but they're positioned in a geometric form. To me, they look like chicken feet. So on the line there, we've made a little stitch. Come back to the base again. Make a little stitch off to the side, the same length. And back to the base again. And this time we're going to angle up this way. Now I've come up in front of one of these chicken toes, and I'm going to add a little bead. There's one. And I'm not coming up directly on the end of the stitch, but just a tiny bit in front of it. And again, when you're going into the fabric, you're going to stitch length will equal the width of the bead. So he sits right there. There we go. There's our little chicken print. And you can do a whole line of these. Now anything that has a long stitch like that, we can substitute with a bugle bead. And it's going to be very important to make the stitch length equal the bugle bead. So stitch directly in front of him. Come back to the base. And we're going to go off to the side a little bit because of the width of the bugle bead. We need to have a little bit of room here. Slide that bugle bead down again so you can measure its length against the stitch that you're going to take. Let's position him right about there. So go directly in front of the bugle bead and go into the fabric. Come up over here just a little bit of ways from the other one. And again, we can come in front of each one of these and put our little seed bead for our little chicken feet toes. You can imagine a whole decorative row of these. Let's try this little cord that's been couched here in place. He's been stitched down with some sewing thread, so he's anchored to our fabric. When I talked about earlier the padded beading, this is like a padded cord trim that we're going to do. And see how the cord when it twists, makes that little angled indentation. We're going to use that little angled indentation to make parallel little satin stitch lines over top of him. I'm going to use size 11 seed beads, and I'm guessing I'll probably have to pick up, let's say 5 of them. I'm not quite sure, so we're going to measure the first stitch and see. Let's slide down all our beads. So that's good. So see the little indentation of the cording, we're going to angle up to here. So that stitch is going to be a diagonal stitch over top of our cording, and the cording will keep it raised. Come down to the bottom again. Pick up 5 beads. And so they should sit right next to each other like that. Now I'm going to show you how to make a sequin flower using sequins and beads. I'm going to use some beading thread. First you come up out of your fabric, and we're going to grab a sequin, a little round sequin, and I'm using tiny beads. They're little tiny 14 seed beads. So the little seed bead sits on top of the sequin, just like that. Now I'm going to mark like north, south, east, and west off of here. And I'm going to eyeball it. I'm doing about 1 centimeter or 3/8 half inch. I'm going to come up on one of these marks, and I'm going to pick up this sequence. I'm going to pick up a sequin, a seed bead, a sequin, a seed bead. And you're going to do that 5 times. So there's 5 sequins and 5 little seed beads alternating like that. And then you pick up 5 seed beads. And I'm going to go right next to the sequin like that. Now I come over here and do the same thing. So you do all 4 of your little dots first, alternating sequin, seed bead, sequin, seed bead 5 times, and then 5 seed beads. Do that all the way around on all 4 points. So you finished your 4 little stitches, north, south, east, west, going back towards the sequin. Right here we have them done. What you're going to do now is you're going to stitch 2 more in each space, going all the way around. You don't have to mark these, you can estimate the length by the one on either side of it. And then over here is our finished flower with all of the little petals in there made out of sequins alternating with beads. The fewer beads you put in the center here, the more closed your cabbage rose is going to look. Let's look at some variations on some of the embroidery stitches that I already showed you how to do with beads. This one here is the running stitch, which we learned a long time ago. Running stitch with embroidery floss, and then alternating adding a bead, alternating adding 2 beads. Running stitch with come back then, and then you're couching like a stem stitch over top of your running stitch just using beads. Here's the stem stitch, 1 bead at a time, 2 beads at a time in a stitch. Now we're alternating. Just floss, bead, bead, bead in a stitch. Just floss for 3 stitches, 1 bead, 1 bead, 1 bead per stitch. Again, here's the stem stitch, and we're crossing over with lines of seed beads. 3 on that one, 1 on this one. All kinds of variations. And here's the one we did with bugle beads. 1 bead in between crossing over, 3 little seed beads crossing over. And again our running stitch, where we just alternated using little seed beads and little short bugle beads as a decorative running stitch. Here's our little rope that we couched with seed beads over the top, so it's like a padded stitch. Here's the lazy daisy stitch again, done in a circular motif like a flower, and the little bead is stitched on that little stitch that holds the loop down. Here the lazy daisies are done almost like in a trefoil pattern, and a little stitch alternating underneath. On the next set of lazy daisy stitches, they're sewn together like a little clump of flowers. There are no beads actually incorporated in the lazy daisy stitch. I've come back and sewn beads between the stitches afterwards. This next clump of flowers in your front yard using lazy daisy stitches, again, have the beads sewn above them and below them in a repetitive pattern. You can come up with all kinds of variations. As long as you repeat it, it looks great. On the feather stitch, the first one looks just like the one we practiced on our sampler. Kind of looks like a wisteria. Then I tried adding beads on just one side with floss showing on the other side. In this case here, I just did the feather stitch with floss and then came back and tipped those with 1 bead sewn on. And in this variation, we tried sewing beads in the little space in the middle there. And of course, the next variation from that again would be sewing the little beads on just one side. The next one is the buttonhole stitch. Here I varied the lengths of the buttonhole stitch. So this one's short, long, short, long, short, long, and then came back afterwards and sewed little beads on the tips, like dotting the eye. Here's the one we practiced on our sampler. And in this case, I showed you just the floss section of this on the sampler, where one buttonhole stitch goes down, the next buttonhole stitch goes up. Down, up, down, up. And here's where I stuck some beads in. 1 bead at a time, just as an embellishment, were sewn on afterwards. In little clusters, no beads, little clusters, no beads. The next one is our chicken feet. We did this one with our little floss thread feet and little dots of beads for the toes. And then here it is, 3 of them in a row, done with bugle beads and seed beads on the tips, dotting the eyes. Another fun stitch, we've tried using floss here, almost like a long satin stitch, short stitch, long stitch, short stitch, and then dotted the short stitches with a little bead. Here's it is again, long stitch, 2 little beads, long stitch, 2 little beads. As long as it's repeating, it turns into a trim. And any long stitch can be substituted with a bugle bead. So here we've done the same thing with bugle beads. Bugle bead, 2 dots. Bugle beads, 2 little seed beads. And then again the first one, long bugle, short bugle, dotted with a seed bead. Long bugle, short bugle, dotted with a seed bead. Then the next row, we tried using our herringbone stitch. So this is a long row of that. Here it is with just floss and 3 little beads added to just the stitch that went from lower left to upper right. More just floss, and then 2 larger beads added on each stitch that just went from lower left to upper right. The other stitch is just floss. Let's look at some garments now that used many of these stitches. Now let's try some edging stitches, beaded edgings. And what is it about putting edging on a plain scarf that all of a sudden transforms it into evening wear? It's just magical. Let's start on our little sampler here. I'm using some facile, and I'm going to stitch right into the edge of it. I'm just using beading thread, NYMO size D. I'm going to use a little bit larger beads so that you can see. Now you've already experienced using the picot stitch, which we closed up the pin with. It has variations too. Instead of picking up 3 beads, let's pick up 5 beads. 1 bead width away through the fabric, and we're going to go back through 2 beads. This time, let's try making our terminal bead a different color. So pick up our different color first, and in this stitch, since it's shared with the previous stitch, we only need to pick up 3 beads. 1 bead width away from the previous stitch, go into the fabric from back to front, and back through the last 2 beads that you added with the point of the needle coming towards you now. Let's do 1 more. Pink bead, 2 teal beads. Bite of fabric, 1 bead width away, back through the last 2 beads with the needle coming towards you now. There's our little edging stitch. It's just a little bit taller of a picot stitch. Now let's open the stitch up, make it more lacy. It's called netting now. Let's pick up an odd number of beads, 5 beads. And we're going to stitch a little bit farther away from our last stitch. Little bite of fabric, front to back, actually back to front, back through the last bead, just going back through 1 bead. It's an open, lacy loop of beads now. Our normal loop will have 5 beads, but because we're sharing the previous loop, this time I only pick up 4 beads. That 1 bead is shared between the 2 loops. Little bite of fabric. I'm going to go about 1/2 inch away from the previous stitch. Back through just the last bead with the needle coming towards me now. 1 more. Now when doing this stitch on garments, to make your netting nice and even, so you don't just eyeball the stitch length each time, take a ruler and actually measure where you need to stitch ahead of time. You can put a little pin there, you can use a little dot of air erasable marker, but somehow mark it where you're actually going to take your stitch so that they're all nice and even. Now let's do a little variation and do a spiked netting. 3 beads. Oh, let's make it 3 more and make it a taller spike. Slide the last bead that you picked up out of the way. That's your terminal bead, like when we did our short fringes in the nautilus pin. Go back through the other 2 pink beads. And what we're doing is we're making kind of like a tiny short fringe in the middle of our piece of knitting. Tighten him up. Now let's pick up 4 more teal beads. Bite of fabric. And back through the last bead that you picked up with the needle coming towards you now. Spiked netting. You can even hang a drop from the bottom there. Let's do 1 more. This time we're going to pick up 3 teal beads because that 1 bead in the middle is shared. and back through the last bead. There we go. Now let's look at some examples of some samples I made for you using these netting stitches. Here's a pair of socks that I've beaded. Obviously special occasion socks. They can still be hand laundered, however, because the colors in these beads are permanent. I've used pressed glass flowers and leaves up here and spiked netting with flowers on the tips down here. And because the netting is done so close together, I can still stretch the sock to get it over the heel of my foot. And here's a very special greeting card. I used pressed glass beads again, little leaves, little flowers, little seed beads, and I twisted some ribbon and knotted it and used the little seed beads to tack that ribbon down. Around the edging, I did some plain netting, 7 beads, but before I started the netting, I took a pin and I punched a little hole along the edge every ½ centimeter so that the netting was nice and even. What is it that makes fringes so sensual? Is it because they mimic the movement of our bodies? Unfortunately, being this glamorous fringe is dangerous. Your life can be cut short by a car door. So usually I make my fringes in a little bit heavier thread to protect them. Now you can make fringes all in a straight line like little army men. You can make fringes that undulate like a curtain. You can have them all bunched together in the corner of a scarf like a tassel. Let's try making a basic fringe and then I'll show you some variations. I'm going to be working on this fabric that's just taped to the counter for convenience here. Let's pick up several beads, 10, 12, 15, a length of beads. I'm going to put a flower near the end of my fringe. Here's our length of beads. I have a little yellow terminal bead. Now I'm going to take my needle and go back through all those beads. The most important thing to do is not pierce the thread that's already in the beads. If you can pull back with all the beads on your needle, you haven't pierced the thread. Pull up, and to tighten the fringe, I grasp the little terminal bead, hold it while I tighten the thread. You want it tight enough so that there's no thread showing up here, but you don't want it so tight that the fringe has rigor mortis and it's real stiff. On garments, I usually take a bite of fabric between my fringes, and you can even make a little knot at this point. That way, if one fringe breaks, you only lose those beads and everyone else is safe and won't come off your garment. Here's my little stitch. Let's make another fringe. Pick up a lot of beads, the entire length that you want your fringe to be. I'm going to pick up another flower bead. And this time, instead of just a straight little bottom, let's make a little loop on the bottom. There'll be no terminal bead. I'm picking up some smaller size 11 beads now. So here's our length of fringe. Again, I'm going to go back through all the beads with my needle. And I pull down while they're on the needle. That way I know I haven't pierced the thread that's inside. Push up the needle, grab the top. And this time we have a little loop of beads on the bottom instead of just a single terminal bead. Now let's make a different kind of fringe. Let's make a twisted fringe. This time I'm going to pick up a lot of size 11 beads. enough 11 beads to come all the way down and loop all the way back up again. So it's like twice the length of the fringe that you want the fringe to eventually become. So now I've strung enough beads for a little more than twice the length that I want my finished fringe to become. Now I'm twisting my thread. If you're already using sewing thread or a thread that has a twist in it, you want to turn in the direction that the thread already has a twist. In other words, don't untwist the twist that's already in the thread. If you're using parallel filament thread like monocord or what Nymo is, it doesn't matter which way you turn it. Just turn it lots. So I'm twisting it and I'm holding that twist in the fringe and not letting it escape. And it's got quite a bit in it now because the thread is starting to bunch up on itself. Hold the twist in there, don't let it go. Now that you've got lots of twist in your thread, take your needle and insert it back into your fabric. Never let go of the twists that are in your fringe. Pull it all the way up. Now you'll fight with it a little bit, but this is normal. And now let's turn him into a twisted fringe. Looks just like something that's off the end of a woven scarf. You can variegate the colors, put a different color on your terminal bead. To really keep the twist in the top here, what I would do now is take a little knot with your thread. So there's a twisted fringe for you. Now let's try kinky fringe. This is a great fringe for being very flamboyant, very organic looking, taking up lots of room. Think of the fringe like a tree. We're going to string all the beads for the trunk of the tree. So I've strung all the beads for my trunk of my kinky fringe, and I've done a little color variation here. Pink bead, 2 lavenders, 2 pinks, a lavender, 3 pinks. We're slowly moving toward pink, and then I used a different color terminal bead, the teal here. Now over here in these little earrings that are done with kinky fringe, here's the trunk. Go all the way to the bottom, terminal bead, and as you work back up the trunk, you are making these side fringes. And I've done some color gradation in there also. And that's what we're going to do here. Slide the terminal bead out of the way, go up through a few beads. Make sure you haven't pierced anything inside. Pull that up. Hang on to your terminal bead, tighten your fringe. Now I'm going to string a few beads for a side branch. Here's my little side branch. Slide the terminal bead out of the way, go back through all of these beads. I kind of hang on to that terminal bead, so make this nice and tight as you can, before you go back into the trunk of your kinky fringe. Let's just pull him up. I'm going to go through a few more beads and do another branch up a little bit higher. So I've strung some more beads for another side branch. Again, slide the terminal bead out of the way, go back through all the little branch beads. I hang on to the terminal bead and tighten it up as much as I can. That's what makes it kink. Then go back into your trunk beads. I like putting a very different color for the terminal bead on there because when the fringe twists around, you notice that three-dimensionality of the fringe a lot more when the terminal beads are a different color. One more little branch. Another thing you can do is don't make all the side branches the same length. Vary their length. Make the ones at the top shorter, or make the ones at the top longer than all the other ones. Okay, there's our last little side branch. Terminal bead out of the way. Back through the little branch beads, just the branch beads. Put my finger on the terminal bead and tighten up that fringe as much as you can. And then back into the beads of the trunk. Obviously this is a very time-consuming fringe, but well worth it. Now here's a little earring I've used kink fringe on, but you could just as easily use this coming off of a pin or a hat or any other beaded garment you want to make. You can see where the fringes gradually go from light pink to dark pink. So the tips are all light pink, a little bit of color gradation, and the tips are actually all white. Different lengths of fringes make it a lot more interesting, give it more depth. So here's another fringe called the chain fringe. String a marker bead, 4 of the same color, a marker bead. This marker bead obviously is just a different color. 4 more beads, a marker bead, 4 beads, marker bead, 4 beads, all the way down till you end with a marker bead. Make it the length that you want. Now, we're going to string 4 more of our background bead, and we're going to go back through just that one marker bead right there, and it makes a little loop. Now we're going to string 4 of our purple beads, go through the next marker bead, and tighten it up. 4 more beads, go through the marker bead. I bet you're starting to get the idea here. And tighten the whole thing up. Now we go through our last marker bead, and there's our fringe. It's an interesting fringe. It has a little character, and it's nice fat fringe. It takes up a good amount of space, so you have to do half as many fringes as normal. In the insert, you'll find a pattern for a small doll. This is a great project to practice all your bead embroidery stitches that you've learned in miniature scale. Here's the pattern. Cut out the amount it says for each piece, arms, legs, body. Here's our little arm, already stitched around the edge. Just leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. On outward curves, always clip. On corners, always clip before you turn it around. So we're going to turn this. I use a hemostat. You can find these at lots of stores besides medical supplies. I grasp the inside of the arm with the hemostat, and there it is, right side out. Now I insert the hemostat and poke a little bit to get them all turned right side out. Now take a cotton ball. I've rolled these up into little balls ahead of time so they're ready to go. Grasp them with your hemostat, and then use your hemostat to stuff your doll parts. And I push it in there nice and tight with the hemostat. Stuff all your arms and legs. And here are all our pieces stuffed. On the body, you need to stitch across the base of the neck before you stuff it. The opening down here where the legs go, insert both legs and then hand stitch across there to keep the legs in place. With your arms, pinch the raw edges together and hand stitch the arms to the top of the shoulder here. Remember, thumbs always toward the body. For the head, the top of the head that's open and the bottom of the head is the chin down here. You position that in front, and then the neck is used to whip stitch the head to the body. And these are just whip stitched into place. Here's our completed doll, all stitched together, and the back showing the head whip stitched into place. Top of the head is whip stitched closed before we put any hair on. Now let's have some fun and decorate and dress and bead our dolls. So let's look at some of these dolls and the exact stitches that were done on them. This doll has picot stitch all around the edge, back stitch that is just embellishing the leaf pattern on her dress, really short fringes for hair, a little corsage of flower beads, and feather stitch along the cuff. This little doll has spiked netting on her apron, really tiny netting on her skirt, a little picot stitch on her belt, little loops of beads for her bangs, and twisted fringe, long twisted fringe for hair. This next doll is a real party doll. Feather stitch on the hem, picot stitch all along the edge, and picot stitch along the dress. And in back, it almost looks like dreadlocks, but these are the chain fringe that you just learned. This doll has some great kinky fringe hair, netting on the edges of her clothing, and down the front of her coat is a wonderful three-color blanket stitch that included some drops. And this doll is probably the ultimate party doll here. We have some wonderful black curly hair that's basically just straight fringe tacked down. And we have a beaded flower here in her hair. Her face is done with colored floss. At the bottom here we have just a satin stitch, long stitches with 3 beads on each one along the outer edge of the skirt. Down here we have a line of back stitch, more netting, more netting on an underskirt, and beaded shoes. This is just a sampling of the incredible amount of bead embroidery stitches available to us. I hope you take what you've learned here and build upon that to create yet more.